Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join us as we learn from area professors and teachers as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for today. Now, here is today's program.
Good day to you all. Thanks so much for joining us as we continue our study in the Word. We're especially enjoying the series that we've recently entered. We have 5 successive lessons from the Sermon on the Mount. Last week, some of you joined us for a wonderful lesson from the Beatitudes with which the Sermon on the Mount begins. And we move on right into the next passage today as we're looking forward to these 5 lessons in this series. The Beatitudes, David, had an emphasis on the character of kingdom people.
Yes.
Which we found significant. Mm-hmm. Before we start talking about how we act, we think about who we are. Yeah. But we do get a little closer to the action
today we put those character traits into action.
Into action. And we have 2 very well-known sections of the Sermon on the Mount. The first has to do with 2 beautiful analogies that Jesus used of kingdom people, salt and light. Jesus was fond of using metaphors and analogies to describe his own character and his own role, right? We see especially in John's Gospel. And light is one of light is one of the analogies that he uses for himself. And now he's applying it to his followers, but also others, bread and shepherd and things like that. Then the other thing we get to do today is move on into Jesus' discussion of the ethical basis for the Christian life. Is it based on law or not? And the answer is yes and no.
Yeah, it's a whole connection to the Old Testament. Where does the Old Testament stand in relation to Christian faith?
Yeah, so we have kind of 2 important topics to talk about today. He began with right attitudes and is now moving on to right actions. It's probably worth remembering that when Jesus began the Sermon on the Mount, according to chapter 5, verse 1, he seems to have been focusing his teaching on his close disciples who've already made a commitment to follow him, right?
And it's clear there's a distinction between Christians and the rest of the world and some responsibilities that are entailed in following Jesus. And that's really what he's saying here. It's partly those character traits, but it's also the actions. It's what we do, how we live.
And it's interesting that although he sees his followers as having stepped away from the world, as it were, in order to make a commitment to him, it's not, discipleship is not an isolation from the world.
No.
We're meant to have an impact on the world, right?
That emphasis of both salt and light is the impact on the world.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's look for that as we look through those passages. I'll read. We'll begin in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, which says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven.
That's great.
Okay, well, we have two sections here. The first are these two beautiful and powerful analogies of salt and light. Maybe we should think about what they have in common, because they appear to be two analogies that are making the same point rather than two separate points. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, there's a connection, and yet there's a distinction too.
Okay.
But yeah.
Yeah. So let's start. What do they have in common?
Well, they both have an influence on others.
That's good.
We're, as Christians, we're conscious of the people around us and the people who may not agree with us and may not live like us, but whose lives we can affect by our faith and our actions.
So as we talk through these first verses here, that's the first thing we can be looking for, maybe. What is the positive impact that each of these analogies has, and what kind of positive impact should Jesus' disciples have around them? But then you rightly say that each one is distinct too.
Right.
Salt and light have different characteristics, so we'll be looking for the differences as we go. You are the salt of the earth, so he's not talking about being sequestered away in a salt shaker.
Right, yeah.
Just me and Jesus. Salt that's meant to have an impact on the earth around it.
Yeah. And salt was very important then, as it still is today.
Yeah.
But even at one time, people were paid with salt. That's where the word salary comes from.
Right. The Roman army was frequently paid in salt.
Yeah.
That's just how valuable it was. Well, let's name some of the ways in which salt was used in the ancient world.
Well, primarily preservation.
Yeah.
It was used to preserve meat and save things.
Yeah. So in an era before refrigeration and electricity, the best way to preserve things, and this is true right up into the early 20th century even.
Yeah.
People were still...
well, even, we still get country ham. It's
that's right.
Salt treated.
Beef jerky.
Yeah.
Can't do without beef jerky. So for century upon century, salt has been used by people to preserve meat and things like that. So it's a preservative.
Yeah, but it enhances taste, and that's where a lot of us grab that salt shaker because we eat something and it needs a little salt. And it's not that we're wanting to taste the salt, it's what the salt does to the flavor of the food itself.
Yeah. I suppose somebody maybe has a problem with eating salt, but I don't think I've ever seen anybody pour a spoonful of salt and eat it.
No.
I mean, the purpose of salt is not eating it, the salt. The purpose is to enhance the flavor of other foods. And then I'll mention another common use of salt in the ancient world, which is for cleansing, frequently of wounds. So it had a medicinal
You pour salt in a wound, it's painful,
right.
but it's helpful.
We still use that expression, right? Pouring salt on a wound. But that's because it was done to purify it and to cleanse it. So, the thing that those three uses have in common, that is preserving, cleansing, and flavoring, all have in common what you began by saying. The purpose of salt is to have a positive effect on something else. The meat that it preserves, the food that it flavors, the wound that it cleanses. Yeah. And that makes it a very powerful analogy for the Christian life.
It does. And it's often a quiet influence by the character and the lifestyle we live. We can affect other people just as they observe how we live, how we act.
Yeah. And the purpose isn't to gain attention for ourselves, notice, because, I mean, if you eat food and you notice the salt,
it's too much.
There's probably too much salt, isn't there?
Yeah.
You say, oh boy, those eggs are just too salty, I can't eat that. So the flavoring and the cleansing, all of those functions are, I've had some ham I love a good country ham, but sometimes I've had a ham that was so salty it was practically inedible.
Hard to eat,
yeah. And so the purpose is not to call attention to ourselves at all. It looks like salt can lose its positive impact, lose its saltiness, huh? So
it's
that's
worthless
the warning.
when it does.
That's the warning here, that if you're following Jesus, you dare not lose your positive impact on those around you.
But there's a need, a biological need for salt in our lives. And just like we put salt licks out for animals, we need some salt, and the people around us need the influence that we can bring.
Yeah. Well, let's compare that to light. Now, we've already agreed that they share the idea of a positive impact on our surroundings, but the uses of light are more obvious, I guess, to illuminate, right? But in the ancient world, people used light to illuminate a room or to illuminate a path, maybe. I mean, they had oil lamps that they used.
And without batteries or electricity, they had oil or candles which were expendable and precious, so you didn't want to waste it. You didn't put it under a bowl.
Right.
If you're going to have a light, you're going to use it.
Right. And a light, it's hard to hide light. You have to be really deliberate. So he says it's like a city on a hill. You can't really hide it. It's there, and you see the light. But you can take extraordinary measures to hide your light. And so he uses this kind of ridiculous example of putting a bowl or a basket over top of light. Of course, I think if it was a bowl, you'd not only hide the light, you would extinguish it, which he doesn't mention, but that would be even worse.
But even a small light in a dark place can make a big difference.
Isn't that amazing?
People talk about going into major caves, and quite often the guide will turn everything off and then just light a match. And it's great illumination with a small light.
And we've all had the experience, I assume, one time or another, of walking into a room with a candle or just, like you say, a match light, and it illuminates the whole space in quite a striking way. So this idea of illumination and guidance, I think, are common in the ancient world and in our own, and that's the positive impact. But like salt, which can lose its saltiness, light can be deliberately hidden, and Jesus...
He says, let your light shine.
Yeah, here he gives a command, doesn't he? Unlike, he didn't do that with salt, but let your light shine before other people. So it's not just, look at me, look how I shine, but it's so that other people have the benefit of the light that we bring.
And you're not drawing attention to the light. The good deeds draw people to God.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a fine line there between letting our deeds be seen, or wanting our deeds to be seen, and then avoiding the self-congratulatory thing. So we do good deeds, but God is the one who is glorified. I've noticed that some people are confused about the relationship between good deeds and the Christian life. I've had many, many people say to me that they've been taught that deeds, or what we do, actions, works sometimes is the word, have nothing to do with the Christian life. I think what they mean, what they're trying to say, is that good works, good deeds, are not the means of salvation.
You can't earn your salvation.
Right. But it's not true to say that they have nothing to do with it, because as this passage and many, many others, good deeds, good works is the inevitable, desirable outcome of salvation.
James makes a strong emphasis. You say you have faith, I have works, show me your faith without works, I'll show you my faith by my works.
Yeah, and even Paul, who is sometimes set over against James as emphasizing grace as opposed to works, says that we were saved by grace through faith for good works in which God has prepared beforehand. So even Paul saw very clearly that although the means of salvation was God's grace, the inevitable and desirable outcome of salvation is good works, or good deeds, as Jesus says here.
Yeah.
But the glory goes to God.
Right.
So we need to think of good deeds in terms of results and outcome rather than means or cause. Yeah. Well, by the way, the word bowl in verse 15 may be better translated basket. The word more often implied a basket, but even so, a basket would limit the light, unlike a bowl. All right, well, that's a good understanding of these first two analogies, these metaphors of salt and light, and they're pretty powerful. Now we come to this second part of our lesson where Jesus shifts his attention to the relationship between the law and the teachings of righteousness. And what he's doing here is setting up a series of 5 examples that he's going to give throughout the rest of chapter 5 about the law, the misinterpretation or misapplication of the law by Jews of Jesus' day, and Jesus' corrective of that.
Right.
And there are 5 of them. We're going to study 4 of them in succeeding lessons. And this is the paragraph that kind of introduces that concept. Yeah. So he begins by saying, don't think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish, but to fulfill. How should we think of that?
Well, the law and the prophets, it's instructive to isolate that too, because the Tanakh, the Old Testament today, is the Torah, the law, and then the prophets, the Nevi'im, which includes in what we think of as history as well as prophets. And then there's the Ketubim, the writings. And Jesus is saying that the law and the prophets are both instructive and normative for life, and that's not to be thrown away.
Okay.
And he's not destroying the Old Testament with his ministry.
So he wants his disciples, his close followers, to take the Old Testament, to continue to take the Old Testament seriously. And this phrase, the law and the prophets, you're suggesting, is kind of used as an overall, overarching term, what we might call the Old Testament.
Right.
Yeah, although he only mentions 2 of the 3 sections, it probably refers to the whole thing. And the fact is that all 3 sections of the Old Testament highlight the positive importance of the law. The first 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, contain the law.
Right.
The prophets emphasize the importance of obedience to the law.
Both historically and through proclamation, preaching.
Right. And the dangers, we have examples and teaching about the dangers of disobeying the law, especially the laws regarding worship of God and not the worship of idols.
And the ethical implications of the law.
And then in the writings, the 3rd section that isn't actually mentioned here, the book of Psalms frequently talks about the beauty of the law and how we need to love the law of the Lord.
It's more a testimony poetically, an appreciation of what God has given, where the Torah and the prophets are God's teaching, God's direction for us, either through commandment or action. But the Ketubim is a reflection and appreciation of that.
Yeah. So we're called on to meditate on the law of the Lord day and night in the Psalms. So the whole Old Testament is full of appreciation for the law. And here Jesus says, I am too. So he doesn't want to abolish that, but then he uses the word fulfill. Let's explore a little bit in what sense Jesus is thinking of fulfilling the law. I think one idea is that Jesus puts the law on its proper footing. He puts it on its proper understanding of not just some kind of legalistic way in which we please God, but the way in which we bring our lives into a submissive and right relationship with God.
Yeah, the whole Old Testament is the record of God's creation, of God's working through the people, in order that the entire world may be in a good relationship with God. And as Jeremiah said in chapter 31, that old covenant, Old Testament, is really coming to a point of a new covenant of where people want that relationship, not by commandment, but by desire. And that's what Jesus is coming to do, bring that new covenant to show us the fulfillment of all that Old Testament, Old Covenant, into the new covenant.
Yeah. And part of the fulfillment is in his own life, his own messianic ministry, where he actually fulfills prophecy.
Right.
But part of it is in his reiteration of the moral teachings of the Old Testament to show us how God still cares about our relationships with other people, our relationships with God. So it's not exactly a new law, but it is a new understanding of the law in the light of salvation through
When he
Jesus.
was being questioned by some of his critics, what's the greatest law? He said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And the second is like to it, to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets are in these two.
Right.
That love of God, love of people, that comprises what God has given to us.
In both of those greatest laws are quotes from the law.
Right.
So Jesus didn't say, oh, it's not about the law, it's about love. He quoted from the law to say the law is about love.
Yeah.
And as James later will write, the Christian writer James, love is the royal law. It's the way in which Jesus has taught us to properly understand the law. So that's the idea of fulfilling there. Some of our viewers will have noticed verses in the New Testament that make it sound like Jesus did come to do away with the law. There's a verse in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 15 that says Jesus abolished the law and knocked down the dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles. And it does sound there like a direct contradiction of Jesus' claim not to abolish the law. I think what Paul means there is that Jesus did do away with the false distinction between God's love for Israel, the covenant people, and God's love for Gentiles. And Jesus knocked down that misinterpretation of the law and said, no, God wants all people to come to him. Does that make sense?
Yes, and where Hebrew people tended to sometimes use the Old Testament and the laws of the Old Testament to put that barrier up between Gentiles and them. Jesus came to knock that, to destroy the curtain, the separation, so there's no longer a barrier.
Yeah, but Paul isn't saying that Jesus came to abolish all connection to the Old Testament law. Yeah, there's another verse in Colossians that talks about Jesus nailing the law to the cross, or that the law was nailed to the cross at his death. And there again, he probably isn't saying that the law is of no value or meaning to kingdom people, but that salvation was never through law keeping. God's plan always appears to have been that salvation was through the sacrificial death of Jesus.
Yeah, and in Galatians, Paul talks about the law being that school teacher, that pedagogue, to bring us to the point of the relationship with God through Christ.
Yeah.
But it's not that we now repudiate the Old Testament and throw it out because we're Christians and we have no more need for the Old Testament. We realize our whole understanding of Jesus and what he has done for us is built on that foundation of the Old Testament and all that's gone before.
Yeah.
So we still appreciate it, but we've seen it fulfilled.
Exactly. Yeah. I would say that from my perspective, the ethical life of Christians today is not based solely on the Old Testament. In other words, my morality is not based on the Ten Commandments, I would say. My morality is based on the way in which Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law, including the Ten Commandments, through his own example and teachings, and ultimately sacrifice on the cross. But I can only understand properly and fully Jesus' ethical life and teachings through the background of the law, which he himself was living to fulfill.
Yeah.
There are a couple of little words here in verse 18 that we need to make sure people understand. Until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter or least stroke of the pen will disappear from the law. What was the smallest letter?
Yoda.
Yeah, in Greek it's the iota. In Hebrew it's called yod, or jot. In the King James, people know the word jot. It's yod, and it's just a little, it looks like a little boomerang. It's just a tiny little letter. It looks like an apostrophe almost. And that's how tiny it was. So that's the smallest letter. And the least stroke of the pen refers to just a little hook that you might put on a letter.
The King James, the tittle.
The tittle, yes. The word in Hebrew literally means horn. So it's like if you had a picture of a bull and you put a little horn on it, it would just be a little tiny little mark. And some of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet have a little crook on it in a place. So it's just his way of emphasizing the positive nature of God's revelation in the law. I love the two verbs that are used in verse 19 near the end. Whoever practices and teaches these commands. It's not enough simply to follow God's will. We're expected to influence others. And it's certainly not enough to tell other people how they should live and then not practice it yourself.
Practice what you preach.
So I think that combination of verbs there, practice and teach, is quite telling.
And then he brings in righteousness again.
Oh, we're back to righteousness, being aligned with God's will, right relationship with God. Now, in what sense should our righteousness surpass that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law? I thought they were the Jews who really valued the law and emphasized it.
They stressed it and emphasized the details of visible actions, but Jesus constantly criticized them for not having the heart behind it. There was a hypocrisy. They were doing things on the surface, but not underneath. And we'll see in the subsequent lessons we've got where they took some of the teachings of the Old Testament and minimized or modified to the point where they took away the emphasis God had put on it, and their own teachings were virtually contradicting the Old Testament.
So they appeared to value it, but by twisting it and interpreting it to their own ends, they really undermined the law. And as Jesus said, you appear to keep the law superficially, but you ignore the weightier matters of the law, like mercy and justice and things like that. Well, this has been a helpful exploration of the way in which Jesus both valued the law and fulfilled it.
In the call for Christians to be salt and light.
And we're going to see some practical examples in the upcoming lessons. We're so glad that you could join us today and hope you've benefited from our conversation. We urge you to keep thinking and reading and studying these matters in the light of what we've said, so that we can all come to a point of joyful obedience to our Lord and example, Jesus. Hope you can join us again next week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson brought to you as a ministry of First Christian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee. Our thanks to our teachers that led us for this week's lesson. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of First Christian Church.